Einen schönen guten Tag. Ich freue mich,
Good afternoon. I am very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Böll-Stiftung to our new edition of Decolonial Dialogues.
Bienvenue to the new edition of the Decolonial Dialogues. Diese Veranstaltung ist digital.
This event is digital and multilingual. That is to say, we will have interpretation into German, English, and French.
Bitte nutzen Sie dafür
Please use the globe button at the bottom of your
For
screen.
translation into German, English, and French, please press the little globe button on the bottom of your screen. An dieser Stelle zunächst erstmal
A big thanks
das Kuratorinnen-Team.
to the curatorial team.
Kupka,
These are Marit Ifioma Kupka, Filmon Gemay, and Thomas Fuß. Last year and this year, they have filled the decolonial dialogues with a lot of life. Last time, when we met in March, we talked about the content and direction of the decolonialization debates in Europe and Africa. And today we'd like to focus on the question of how restitution of colonial looted property can contribute to building and deepening relations between African and European actors. The return of ancestors and the restitution of stolen cultural artifacts are important steps towards coming to terms with colonial injustice. But restitution should not be the end of an entangled history between survivors and perpetrators. It should be the start of a new level of relationship. Last week, we had a heated debate about the restitution of the Benin bronzes. And we are very pleased that the current debate, which is very much Germany-centristic, will now be enriched by voices from South Africa, Nigeria, and Cameroon. We would like to invite you to join our dialogue after the panel discussion. We are happy to have such a large international audience today. Feel free to join us on Twitter using the hashtag #decolonialdialogues. We are very happy that Aisha Kamara will be the moderator once again, as usual. She is a communication expert and moderator. She will also introduce our panelists today. But first, we will hear from Dr. Marit Ifioma Kupka. She will give us an introduction. Marit is an art scholar, author, co-curator of these dialogues, and many more things. So, Marit, you have the floor.
Ja, schönen guten Abend.
Good evening. Today's episode of the Decolonial Dialogues couldn't be more topical. A couple of days ago, there was an article in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and there was a debate about one text that called the return of the bronzes a fiasco. The transfer of ownership to the Oba in Edo State by President Muhammadu Buhari, who is going to leave office at the end of the month, would, according to the authors of the media article, make the bronzes private property. And thus, in that way, they would threaten possible accessibility for the public. That's a danger that the author already saw when 20 bronzes were handed over to the Nigerian government by the German government in December last year. Quite a few people agreed with the author of that article. Others strongly disagreed. And basically, one can see two camps here. And they also can be found in discussions about the restitution of other objects. There's one camp that would like to see restitution, if at all, linked to clear conditions. And there's another camp that calls for unconditional restitution. Both positions have in common that there is a state into which one can restitute. For some people, this current status is unacceptable, and many people say there are political conflicts. That is the reason why one cannot restitute. And for others, there's the idea of reasonableness. And here the intention is to do good for injustice committed. What is interesting about the German debate is that the Nigerian perspective hardly ever play a role, while in Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung certain hints are being made regarding controversies in Nigeria, but this does not lead to a situation where we think about the entanglements of Africa and Europe, and many conflicts have their origins in the violent clash of over 200 ethnic groups and the things that happened in the Berlin Conference in 1878. The central difficulty in dealing with restitution is that certain negotiation structures are predetermined. State representatives negotiate amongst themselves, and so do institutions. They have an internal exchange. But in the case of the Benin bronzes, and that is true for many other cases, it is not the state of Nigeria as a nation that was robbed. It's a specific historical context that was created in colonial times and then later became a state of Nigeria. A central difficulty is that we do not have a different cultural context. The role that Benin bronzes play as well cultural heritage for many people in Europe does not have the same importance for Nigeria as a state. For some groups inside their specific context, these bronzes are very valuable and very important. So who negotiates with whom, especially when we want to make an attempt to sort of make up for colonial violence? So the question should be, how can we address things correctly and not do things wrong? How can we imagine things outside colonial continuities? Conditions for restitution could make sense if they concern the former colonial powers. And we have seen in the negotiation process, these powers oftentimes do not really see themselves as really a legacy of the colonial times. The challenge would be to find ways of cooperation beyond paternalistic determination. What is real cooperation? What should be the conditions for a new and very ethical relationships? And this concerns both European actors and African actors. In media coverage, such as we have seen it in Germany, we see hardly ever an attempt to go beyond the traditional boundaries. Artists, intellectuals, activists, NGOs have been dealing with this issue about the cultural heritage and the future of this African cultural heritage. They create spaces for a discussion about restitution. So how can we succeed in bringing this position into the international negotiation process, both on the European and African levels? Today, we are not going to talk about the Benin bronzes specifically. We have invited experts that are going to deal with the restitution from various angles. Restitution, as I always say, is much more than just the logistical return of looted property from colonial context. I also would like to emphasize once again that looted property is just a comprehensive term, but there's so many different things that are included. Human remains, art, central cultural objects, and things where knowledge has been stored. And the absence of that also makes it impossible for cultures to develop individually and independently. Things and objects and property is very different. Is a return really possible? And here I really mean, can everything be returned? And where should it go to? If the construction of a museum would be the solution, how should the museum look like? So it is not just a continuation of the knowledge hierarchies of colonial times. How should a museum look like to be a true space for healing and development? The questions of places of return is an old question, and the debate in Germany shows that it is still a very relevant debate, but there are many more issues at stake. The objects have traveled, have been absent from their origins for a long time, so they've been in the diaspora. Maybe the objects have changed themselves. How about the objects that cannot return anymore? In a panel discussion that I have organized in Lagos in February, there was your ikenga is always linked to you. It grows and flourishes with you, and it dies when you die. So how can it be that such ikenga would be in European collections where the people they belong to, and how can these ikenga return because the place they belong to is no longer there? A lot is at stake at the moment, and I am looking forward to the discussion. Welcome to our panelists, and also welcome to all people following this debate. And I hand over to you, Aisha.
Thank you very much, Marit. A warm welcome also from my side. At home, wherever you are, in front of your screens, I would like to welcome you very warmly. And let's get down to the discussion right away. Restitution as an endpoint or as a starting point of what happens after the restitution. Well, this is the starting point, and let me tell you already that we will not be able to answer the question what exactly will happen after looted goods have been returned, but we can talk about some basics, and you can look forward to putting things in perspective, and you will also hear African perspectives and looking beyond the fence, and the fact that you will recognize that the topic of discussion is even more complex than one should think. I do not want to waste any time here. Let me introduce the panelists and let me ask them to switch on their cameras so that we can start the discussion. And I would also like to explain the timeline. We have got about 1 hour in order to discuss with each other. And after that, we will open the Q&A floor. So you will have the possibility of either using the questions button and thus submit your questions in writing, but you can also participate directly here by show of hands, and we would welcome that as well. So first of all, I would like to ask everybody who is here, first of all, to switch on their cameras, to leave them switched on. And secondly, I would like to ask everybody to introduce themselves. Well, and we have people with fascinating CVs here, but you can also go to the Heinrich-Böll Foundation website and read more. Let me introduce the first panelist, Dr. Oluwatoyin Zainab. She's the director of Asa Heritage Africa. She's an architect, she's a cultural scientist and a museum scientist, and she has taken a Nigerian perspective in order to talk about the restitution of the Benin bronzes, the customary laws on objects in the discourse, and so on. She founded the Asa Heritage Foundation. It's a non-governmental organization that deals with the preservation of the national heritage. I would like to leave it here, and a warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you.
Danke. Well, I would like to continue with the next panelist. That's Molemo Moiloa. She lives and works in Johannesburg, and she works at the intersection of cultural practice and community organization. And at the moment, she deals with the social infrastructures of cultural organizations and also relationship with nature. And she is a part of the collaboration of Make You Look, and she does research in terms of knowledge production, and she also leads the Open Restitution Africa project and Africa-focused research platform for the restitution of African heritage under the auspices of Andani Africa. And what's also quite interesting, Make You Look, well, she was also a grant holder and also an artist at Documenta, and it's great to have you here. I would like to continue with another perspective, and this is Sylvie Njobati. She's a restitution activist and the Sysy House of Fame founder in Cameroon, and she had a campaign for the restitution of looted goods by Germans. She works in close conjunction with the National Fund, and she talks about, well, colonial past, and she works in close consultation with the traditional king fund of the Nuso. And also in space where complex identity like theirs find a home. And then I would like to introduce Richard Leguerre and Andreas Mehler. And Andreas Mehler is the director of the Arnold Breckstrisser Institute Freiburg, and he talks about and works about power sharing after peace agreements, violent conflicts, crisis prevention, state and statehood, German and French Africa policy. And then Richard Leguerre joined the IBI at the same institute, that is, as a postdoctoral researcher, and he's a trained historian, and he will investigate the mediatization of the restitution of African cultural heritage looted during the colonial period, and he's particularly interested in the impact of the digital turn on these databases. Both work on a research project called Restitution Governance in European Comparison. Well, and they work about complex items, collector's items from colonial contact, the key issue paper on this topic adopted 4 years ago, and I think we will delve more deeply into the project. I've told you quite a lot about our panel, and I would like to hand over to the others. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for joining in, and I would like to name the elephant in the room. It is a very German elephant, as Dr. Kupka said it already, and I would now like to address Dr. Toprisen, and after Dr. Kupka talked about it, I would like to know what debate is happening in Germany about the restitution of the Benin bronze to private ownership. What is your stance on the debate? And, well, from the Nigerian point of view, what do people think? And should there be a Nigerian point of view? Well, we don't know, but let me ask for your stance on the current debate.
Okay, Aisha, I think that's me. There was a delay. So my view on the current debate is quite interesting, that finally the objects that were returned are going to be given to the rightful owner, in quote, the rightful owner, because Benin, these objects were looted from Benin. They belonged to the Oba, they were looted from the palace. And they were objects that were part of the ancestral shrine. They were objects that tell you about the events that had happened. And now they've been returned to Nigeria, as at the time there was nothing like Nigeria. They've been returned to Nigeria, and Nigeria is identifying with the Oba to say it belongs to the Oba, But the Oba is going to work with the nation of Nigeria to coordinate everything that's going to happen or how these objects are going to be used or managed. On one side, I'm happy about it. On the other side, there are lots of questions to still be answered. Such questions as, how many people really, everyday Nigerian, how many people know about what's been returned, what's yet to be returned, and where are they? So it's still an elitic few, the academia, and that will be few as well, whose focus is on this restitution or focus is on the bronzes. And so there's still much work to be done. Restitution is, for me, is actually a start. The work just started. And you're just getting a little drops of these so many artifacts that are outside. It's just the beginning. And yes, it could look like a child's play, but that it has started, it means the work has started. And you're giving back the chance for people to recognize their history, to have something that substantiates who they were, who they are, who they will be, to substantiate their indigenous technology that were used then and that will still continue to be, and maybe even bridge the gap. Because like Dr. Marret did tell us, there was a gap of all this gone. What happened to that knowledge, that gap that had happened? What happened to religious worship? What happened to traditional worship? What happened to identity of the Benin people? We're talking about objects that stand the test of time, of telling us what they were for and how they were gone. They were taken away. They were brutally looted. But the point is bringing them back. We have a lot of generational gap that don't even know about these objects, that have never seen them before and don't know their implications. So the start of returning 20 out of 1,000 plus, it's commendable. It's a start, recognizing that it's the possession, it's the Oba's stuff, using the Ijogbe. The Ijogbe will fall in with the customary law that when your father dies, if it's, you get it, all his things belongs to the custodianship of the first child. And the Oba is the person in place now to be able to take on the custody of his ancestral possessions.
Vielen, vielen Dank. Und was sollte darüber hinaus eben
much? And what should happen on top of that? You said the Oba, the king, should take custody of these objects. He should take custody, but what different communities and players should he continue to work with?
As much as the Oba is in the Gazette, I know most of this conversation are coming up because of the Gazette of 23rd of March. And as much as the Oba is recognized as the owner, I think the museums are still going to be functioning because the Oba will be working with the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, who were the recipients of this on behalf of the Oba. So he will be working with them. He will be working with other actors. MOA is coming up, and he will be working with local communities. But the very first thing I think for all of us to understand is it belongs to the Benin people, simple. And belonging to the Benin people or being with the Oba is us recognizing as well that they were all, a larger percentage of them were looted from the palace. It's a simple analogy of me coming to anybody's home and taking their stuff. And when it's time for me to take it back, I decide to give it to their security guard or decide to give it to someone else who's a neighbor who doesn't even know the implications of these artifacts. Don't forget, most of them were traditionally, as in they support or help with traditional form of worship, which means it's curatorship itself. There's a possibility that you have to be linked ancestrally for you to be able to curate it. So if you're not a son of the soil connected to these objects or these artifacts by blood, there's some artifacts like that, you're not a rightful person to curate. But in this way, hopefully, the indigenous knowledge system gets to be opened more. The Oba will be able to, he will pick people that will be able to vet this indigenous knowledge system about his history, his identity, his culture, his tradition, and we will get to know more about the Bini people, not just what has been written from outside, but we'll get to know more from their own perspective.
Ja, das klingt alles total plausibel.
That sounds absolutely plausible. And that is why my question now is, from your perspective, how come that things that are quite clear and quite plausible would be the starting point of such a heated and controversial debate in Germany in March? There was an announcement saying that the Benin bronzes would be handed over to the Oba. Now, a couple of weeks later, we've got a huge debate. Is there anything you heard about that debate in Nigeria? And what is your assessment of the German debate we are having right now?
The beautiful thing, and I will not really beautiful, but one simple truth is you get to know so much about Africa from outside Africa, and it's so interesting that these conversations are happening like outside Africa. It's like neocolonialism. You're deciding what Africa should still do. It's restitution, plain, plumb, and simple. You get it, and giving it back is a recognition or an acknowledgement of the harm that been done, the wrong that been done. It wasn't bought. It was stolen, then became stuff that were being shared. They were looted. Hey, we're forgetting something. They looted those objects. We could see the objects. How about lives that were taken? Who's going to replace that? How about houses that were burnt? Are we going to build new ones? How about, it's so many questions that can't be answered with just a statement. But the act of recognizing that, hey, I've wronged you, I've taken this when I'm not meant to, is a start for a conversation. So that's the first step in the idea of restitution, that I acknowledge. It's a different case if I'm now saying, Aisha, help me keep my mom's diamond. But the point is, for now, you realize it is mine. It was mine before you took it away. It is mine even when it was with you. Now you've realized it is mine. You just give it back. And after giving it back, we can now have a larger conversation. Because like Dr. Maret did say, Bini bronzes have multiple implications now and has gained this value, this regime of value over time. Initially, it might have been known only by the Benin people, the devotees, the people in the royal court, the people who were directly involved, the different guilds, you get what I mean? But with the looted, Bini bronzes became, champions. They're everywhere. Everyone can talk about them. Even people that have never been to Nigeria before can talk about Bini bronzes. We've had intermarriage, international relations, multiplicity of cultures. We've had overlap of knowledge. So the Oba in his majesty will understand the multiplicity of values that these objects have gained over time. And he will not want to stop that. And if you read the Gazette to the end, he did say everywhere where these objects are, that the Oba will work with Nigerian government to see what is the best way of keeping them safe and to see what is the best way of them being used. So giving them back doesn't make them like you've thrown them away. They're still there in circulation, but we're just kind of starting the book from the cover, not from the middle. That's what we're just doing.
Vielen, vielen Dank.
Thank you very, very much. And I now would like to hand over to Molemo, Moiloa. Now I'd like to ask her maybe to add a few things. Dr. Sogbesan has already given us a lot of insight, and maybe you can widen the perspective. We know that Africa is not one single country. But your research project also deals with different perspectives regarding restitution. And so maybe there are also very different positions that one could identify and highlight.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me here. I have many thoughts. I have to agree with Dr. Toyin on much of what she said. I think even from the perspective of the rest of the African continent, this moment is actually an incredible opportunity. And this so-called drama is in fact a moment of incredible knowledge making and potential for creating new approaches and policies. What is being framed by some as some kind of catastrophic moment is in fact very much a natural part of the process, where we have an opportunity now to think of this as a moment to reimagine what an African museum practice might be, how we might integrate indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous customary practices into African modes of memorialization, African modes of heritage management. It's an opportunity where we can reimagine protocols, develop new best practice, really completely reframe what it's going to be to make museums and to practice museumology on the African continent in the face of things returning back to the continent. That's what this moment is. And Nigeria has the opportunity to develop practice for the continent. And what we don't need at this moment is to behave as if this is chaos, and that the framework of chaos is a very problematic framework. Germany knows what it means to have challenges between a federal state and smaller provinces or whatever in the state. Germany knows what it means to have a fight between a royal family and a state museum. The Daphne Provenance Project was specifically because of that battle. So why Germany sees problems that it deals with as valid problems that are part of museological processes, but then when it happens in the African continent, it's seen as somehow chaos. I think Germans need to ask themselves those questions. You know, if people are feeling like this is the end of the world, they need to ask themselves why Africans are not allowed to go through the processes of working out what this really unprecedented moment means for all of us. No, Germans don't know how to deal with this. Africans don't know how to deal with this, and we're all having to go through a process of how to find the best way to do that. And the kind of foundation that needs to underpin that is some sense of respect and some sense of recognition of our own rights, of our own cultures and our own processes to work out what we're doing. And that is going to be difficult, that is going to be messy, because, you know, it's messy in Germany too.
Vielen Dank. Vielleicht,
Thank you very much. Maybe just in order to show the different opportunities that we have. Of course, in the German context, we think of museums, the big buildings, wonderful halls, decorated halls, but there are also different forms and ways of means to develop museum practices. I think of digital heritage, for instance. So maybe you can tell us about what can be done in that respect.
Sure, yes. The work that we do at Open Restitution Africa is very much oriented towards thinking with particularly other African professionals around what might be the ways that we want to engender this process, and to try and give opportunity to have some thought around what are our approaches, what are our best practices, what are the ways we're going to make knowledge around this. And I think this gives a kind of interesting opportunity to kind of think about also how we might use the tools at hand that are newer tools such as technologies, such as digitization to do so. And part of that also means having to define what we want these tools to do for us rather than just taking on what's given to us. And the digital certainly offers some opportunities. It's often dismissed, particularly on the African continent, because digital restitution has often been thought of in the framework of giving a copy instead of the original. and people resist that unequivocally. And so what does the digital offer us, I think, becomes the question. And there are a number of interesting projects that are doing this as ways of thinking about how we might distribute not just the question of a single object or a group of objects, but as Dr. Toyin said, the knowledges that have that need to be reclaimed, that kind of emerged around the cultures that these objects came from, that can be used to distribute and disseminate knowledges, ideas, access to these objects, to ensure that more people have more connection with them. As Dr. Toyin mentioned, how many people in Nigeria are really having this conversation, understand what has been returned. And the African continent, particularly at a mobile level, is actually very digitally connected. I think there are almost 2 cell phones for every African on the continent. So there is a lot of potential for using the digital to spread these capacities and really to create an Africa-centric conversation that enables us to think about what it is we're trying to do here, and maybe step away from some of the narratives that come from fear or come from the challenges that Europeans are feeling, and try and define some of our own narratives from our own context.
Entkoppeln quasi.
Yes, decoupling, so to say, from Eurocentrism, and focusing on the African continent. That's one side of the story. On the other hand, there's so many unsettled issues. What do you think about the cooperation, the level of cooperation with European institutions?
This is a difficult question. I think that, I think I'm often struck by how much we are entering into new spaces and don't always have all of the full capacities of how to do this work well at every level, and all of us doing that. I think that a large part of the challenge of the cooperation is that inevitably happens in circumstances that are unequal. So for example, some of the research we've done with Open Restitution Africa is looking at how much Africans are sort of present in the narrative, how often we are quoted in the media, how often the books, the articles, the research that's done by Africans is re-referenced by other academics. And it's something like 1 in 12 quoted papers on the Benin bronzes, for example, is written by an African or has an African co-author. And what that tells you is that the vast majority is not African representation. And there are many reasons for that. It's like, it's long-term inequalities. We see this, I would love to do this research, but it wouldn't be very easy. But we see this with funding as well, is that there is a lot of funding going into addressing restitution concerns in Europe, which is important. It's work that needs to be done. European museums are spending a lot of time thinking about restitution issues. This is a good thing. But on the African continent, where these objects will return, where we have perhaps the hardest work to do in trying to reintegrate them into very complex societies, with completely different borders and cultural frameworks, as Toyin was mentioning, completely different people, there's very little resource for this work. And so what we're seeing is an empowering again of the kind of Western side, and much less capacity to do a lot of the preparatory work on the African side. And that again is due to much bigger inequalities that unfortunately all the partners are forced to try and engage with under those circumstances. And I think that challenge is a challenge for African professionals, but it's also a challenge for European professionals.
Vielen, vielen Dank. über die spezifische Verstrickung.
Thank you very much. Concerning the specific details of Germany's own colonial past in connection with Cameroon, we will hear more about it as a result of the negotiations with the Foundation of Prussian Cultural Heritage. Well, the decisions have been made, but not a lot has happened. But maybe Mrs. Njobati can tell us more about it. But Konzo, what does it mean for you and your community in Cameroon?
All right, thank you very much, Aisha, and thank you all for having me here today. When we talk about Gonzo, a lot of people already know about Gonzo. And Gonzo the figure, we had to separate Gonzo the figure from Gonzo the person, because Gonzo the figure that is owned in quotes by the Prussian Heritage Foundation. We revere her as a god. We count on her to guide us to the right direction. She is our connection between the living and the dead. It's through Gonzo that we commune and communicate with our ancestors. And above all, historically, she is the founder of the Gonzo people. And so some years after her passing, the sculpture was made in her image. And as we speak, that's the only image of our founder that we have. So pardon us from so if we do not understand why our history should be locked up in some other place in the world. It doesn't make any sense to us at all. And as you all know, we started this company, and it was just a venture that I must say. We know who we're talking to. As far back as the early 1990s, we had some people writing letters to whom it may concern, to anyone in position to help. And that shows you the importance of Gonzo, because we really wanted to have Gonzo back. And, you know, after the due processes that were done, from, you know, research to a protest in front of the Humboldt Forum to a couple of working sessions, we now have a decision for the return of Gonzo. But what are the next steps? We have Gonzo in Cameroon. And again, it goes back to the complicated procedures of negotiation. Who is the rightful person to stand in front of, you know, the state of Germany to negotiate for the return? We have a paper decision, but what happens next? And this is what we are battling now, because apparently the government of Cameroon is supposed to now step in and negotiate for the return of Gonzo. And in as much as we acknowledge that Gonzo had crossed international boundaries and the state is important, but I think that we need to really rethink how these negotiation processes go, because when you look at Gonzo, Gonzo was looted in 1902, and the current state of Cameroon wasn't what it is today. We can give that argument. And again, it's not a national symbol. Only the people from Zo understand and connect and experience Gonzo. I don't expect someone who is in Yaoundé to understand what I'm talking about. And so this is quite problematic for us at this point in time as well, because again, I want to believe that is another strategy to pull things as long as possible, so that, you know, in the years ahead, okay, if it comes after maybe 2-3 years, now they're taking another time to now discuss another object. And before we know it, in the next 50 years, we will have 5 objects. And that's what I sincerely think about the restitution process. And so there is a need to rethink again the inclusion of communities that have firsthand experience that speak to the importance of the objects. Over, Aisha.
Ja, würde ich definitiv zustimmen. Jetzt aber nur noch mal
Yes, I fully agree, but in very concrete terms. In June 2022, the good news came after years of struggle and campaigning. You got the good news, and then you were told, like, in 2 or 3 years, like, who is negotiating with whom? Can you enlighten us on that?
Well, when it comes to the process of negotiation, I must say that it started as far back as close to 30 years ago, when we actually knew that Gonzo was in Berlin. And it started with, you know, the fun through other notables from SOC, sending letters back and forth. And also because there wasn't these established institutions you could talk to directly about restitution, like the German contact point for collections in colonial context, it was quite difficult to communicate then. But I think sometimes around 2011, there was a letter that did reach the SPK, and the response was that Ngonso is a legal object belonging to SPK. And there were very ridiculous responses. At some point they said, well, we know, it's ours now. We are willing to give it back to you as a loan. And we are also willing to have your fund in Germany and to show him in case he decides to pass by in Germany. So there was no active engagement to have real dialogues. And I remember in 2021, we really had realized that the backdoor talks were not really taking us anywhere. The diplomatic processes of writing letters and no one knowing what we're doing, it wasn't really getting us anywhere. And in September of 2021, I went to Germany to protest in front of the Humboldt Forum. And during that protest, for some reason, by stroke of luck, I had access to the press briefing before the opening of the African section at the Humboldt Forum. And I did ask a question to Professor Patzinger. I asked him, we've been here on this journey for close to 30 years, asking for Ngonso to come back. How long is enough for you to give us back Ngonso? And he gave us the usual excuses you might already imagine. He said, well, there is provenance research that needs to be done. And, there are no community representatives that we could talk to. And of course, that's not true. That's not true. And the case of provenance research, again, was just like, okay, we want to just pull it as long as possible. Because what does provenance research seek to achieve? You have agreed, it's clearly labeled on the object that it is from SOC. Now, the context of acquisition is what they are not very sure. We know that we did not sell Ngonso to anybody. We did not give Ngonso to anybody. So the burden of proof is on you, not on us as SOC people. And we pick up negotiations from there. The first thing that happened was to have like a workshop for us SOC people to really give them an understanding of what objects mean to us, and specifically the importance of Ngonso to us. And then in that same workshop, the SPK now released a statement saying that they have read through their archives and all material that exists, and they now they could now say that Ngonso couldn't have been, given as a gift, and they are willing to work towards a solution. And from that meeting, we had to do like emails back and forth, explaining things here and there, travels to Germany. And then we compiled the results of the meeting, and the curator, Verena, had to speak to the director, Professor Patzinger, who then spoke to the board that was supposed to take the decision. And it's absolutely crazy that our objects, we have people, other states taking decision on whether or not we should take what is rightfully ours. And this again goes to, to expatiate on the inequalities that exist in this conversation, the unequal power relations that existed during the acquisition, during the colonial period, that is more or less being amplified even now that we speak. We had this discussion, and on the 27th of June, the decision came in for the return of Ngonso. But like we do not have Ngonso. We had planned a couple of activities with SPK, because there is also this important question of what happens when these objects are not there. How else do you tell the story? Do you just pretend it did not happen? Do you just attempt to erase the shared history, as they call it? So we had a couple of activities with the SPK, and after that decision, nothing was really happening. We had expected things to move a bit faster, and then the bureaucratic processes of whom to talk to came in. And in sometimes around August, I said, look, we had talked at some point that we needed the fund to come to Germany and the royal team to also sing Ngonso. The fund had never seen Ngonso from whenever. He had never seen it. And there was the slow response of, well, we do not have resources now. We might want to look at it next year. And again, it brings us back to what Molemo is saying. The resources are there for the German institutions to, bring on their provenance research, excuse, and pull it as long as possible. But when it comes to, including communities, making these resources available to communities is really difficult. I mean, you would want to think that during that time, when the royal team came to Germany, you would want to think that Germany supported in some form. They did not. No financial support. As a matter of fact, they denied visas from key team members. And again, this worries me. We are talking about restitution. What is the intention indeed? Because you cannot open doors with one hand and close the same doors with the other hand. And it was quite difficult for us. So as we speak, the expectation is for the state of Cameroon to negotiate with the state of Germany. And I'm not quite clear on what this negotiation might look like, because they masquerade it and they make it look very political, very diplomatic, and inaccessible to the communities. And it becomes really, really difficult for us.
Vielen Dank für diese spannenden Einblicke. Und,
thank you very much for these interesting insights and this true odyssey, really, that you explained to us. And well, the ending is still open, and we are curious to learn how it's going to continue. And if you do not want to add anything, then I would like to invite questions from the audience. If Dr. Sogbesan or others would like to add on that, if
I would like
that
to
is
add
not
something.
the case.
I'd like to add something, definitely. It's pretty important. It's pretty important for Germany to be proactive as well. Germany should not sit down and wait for communities to take the initiative, wage wars, stage protests, travel to Germany, organize working sessions, and plan everything. I do not see the proactiveness of the German institutions at all. But I must really acknowledge that we have a couple of institutions and a couple of individuals who have been very proactive. For example, Nanette, I must mention, she's been very proactive in decolonizing what we know usually as a museum. We have the University of Mainz that approached us to say that we have objects from SOT. We did not even know that. And we want to work with you to return these objects. This is the kind of proactiveness that we need. We do not want to be the victims and the survivors and then act like we are the perpetrators. In as much as we are moving, the German stakeholders need to move as well to meet us somewhere. It's becoming totally ridiculous that we are doing a lot. We are doing a lot. We need to think of how cooperation should look like. We need to think of how partnership should look like. We are the ones thinking, how can we retell the story? We're the ones thinking, what will happen when all the objects leave? It's not in our position to think everything and make it work. It's not in our position as communities to fix your mess. So there is that need for proactiveness from the different German institutions. So we can now go over to questions.
Thank you, Sylvia. That was really touching because I really wanted to know that the Ngonso was back. I knew in June that it said it would come back. I thought by July latest it will be there. But I'm speaking from Nigeria, and you will be looking at me and thinking, okay, you're lucky. But it's about 900 plus artifacts still out there. That's the one for the German side. And so much more. It's like you're just walking from one bureau to the other, and in that museum, you have something from Benin. But we're talking Benin. It's so interesting that we talk about the bronzes because they're iconic. How about the pots, the ethnographic objects that were just picked away and they're not listed, they're just in storage? It's a different case if they were even outside presented and said they were adding knowledge. The museum is meant to be a space that allows you learn. You know, it brings about substance into intangibility. So you're able to see tangible and see the importance of the intangible. But the point is the museum then becomes a store, and it actually participates and benefits from the colonial administration of looting, of denial, of eliminating and alienating objects from their community. So I support you to say it's not all for the communities to determine. It's for German and other European countries to say, we've done this, and how do you want to get it back? I also have noticed that when it comes to the states talking to each other, the power structure also comes to play. He who has the piper dictates the tune. The African countries might not be able to stand with the European countries when it comes to issues of putting money and going to the courts and all these issues. But it would be nice if we have that collaboration and talk through these things. But such negotiations sometimes just brings about temporary loans. Restitution is not about temporary loans. I also loved what Molemo said about the digital space. It's so interesting. I liked the point she picked out that every African tends to have 2 mobile phones. It's consumerism. They have 2 mobile phones simply because one line or one service provider might not be working and they need to switch to the other. They're not meant to. So at the end of the day, it's neocolonialism, like we keep milking these people. But when is it gonna stop? When is the knowledge system, the knowledge power going to be decentralized? When are we going to see Africans as authors of knowledge? When is it going to be added? And we see the restitution actually starting that process. And I know for Sylvia, that process can't even start. I can say in my own position that restitution has started something, but she can't because she hasn't even collected, she hasn't even sent the Ngonso. She's just kind of working on memory. In what is the what of the memory if generations, younger generations cannot even link themselves with the past histories? So this restitution is a start because it opens so many questions. And the digital space, yeah, the only thing is like we're scratching the surface. So Africa is on the digital space doing what? To who and for who? Are the communities connected? Can they even see this? If you go back and look at the restitution, the report of Sa and Savoy, you will see that towards the end, it talked about having this digital formatting from where Africa too is bringing the knowledge on and Europe is, there's still that power imbalance. It can't work. Written is written, and then we come back to the table and then we talk. And then you can learn from me, or you can learn from the source communities, and the source communities will be happy to see how well you've kept their stuff. Don't forget that these things, the ones that are religious objects or used in the shrines, will need to be reactivated. It's reactivation, it's about having some traditional worship or possessional systems. Who's going to bear that? And when are you going to allow them do that to reenact the ancestral collections? So all this, it's a bigger conversation than today. And I'm hoping that this will continue until each and every one on the street of Nigeria can say, yes, we know about restitution. We know about what has come back. That is when restitution has started work.
Vielen, vielen Dank für den Ausblick, für die Perspektive. Wir kratzen noch ein bisschen.
Thank you very much for giving us this outlook. Let's scratch the surface a little more. Dr. Andreas Miller has already raised his hand and wants to add a few things, and maybe he can also speak about your research project. Let me come back to what was said before, and let me try to relate to these 2 cases. I do think that Germany, over and above, is quite slow, quite sluggish. And the case of the Benin bronzes is more or less an exception to the rule. And the question, why is it an exception to the rule? And why were we so quick in returning the Benin bronzes? There are a number of factors that need to be addressed when talking about this overall issue. On the one hand side, of course, Nigeria is considered a democracy. To be a democracy is an advantage. There are government negotiations and they worked out well. And what's most important is it was not a former German colony. And so it is not that painful to do the things we did. Because when you think about the act of looting in Benin City, it wasn't the Germans who did it, it was the Brits. So it's not for Germany that painful to once again talk about this act of looting. I think it is much more important to make progress regarding looted art and ancestors when we talk about things to be restored to former German colonies. That will be more painful. Then we will have to think seriously about our own colonial past. And there it would be very valuable. Like in the case of Ngonzo, we could make progress much faster. I am not sure why things move so slowly. There might be also something on the side of the Cameroon government. I mean, Nigeria is a democracy. When we look at Cameroon, maybe we do not have the same preconditions, but then we have to acknowledge what Sylvie said. The German side must be more proactive, must clearly say we want to restitute. We think it's valuable also for our own debate in Germany and for us to better understand. It is absolutely necessary for African activists, actors, scholars to say what they feel about the whole situation. And of course, you also have to take into account that there are interests on all sides. Of course, we in Germany, we know what museums are thinking, what political parties are thinking, what individual scholars are thinking. So let's take a very in-depth look at, let's try to analyze the different positions and interests, and let's try and find a consensus so that we can at least carry out individual projects and restitute, because I think every act of restitution, and we've seen that in the case of the Benin bronzes, every act of restitution triggers a debate. And this is important because that's the beginning. It's not the end. Once restitution takes place, it is a beginning. And I think the German side should also be interested in thinking about the whole complexity of Germany's colonial past, which means we have to take a much closer look at former colonies, Germany's former colonies. The case of the Benin bronzes, that was the easiest thing. We've seen how difficult it is when it comes to Namibia. Then we also have to look at Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon. Making a step and taking a step forward would be very valuable for our own debate here. That also tells me that Germany hasn't come far enough and we could be much more advanced. Yes, of course. We do have a coalition treaty, a coalition agreement between the coalition government parties. There we have a chapter on colonialism, and restitution could be very helpful because it indeed triggers a debate. The debate can be painful, but it must be triggered. We can be angry about articles in this or that newspaper. It's all fine, but we need this heated debate. And then I think politically we will also push a few things. Without discussions, without even painful discussions, we would just have some kind of attitude where people say, we do not know where the objects are, they're no longer there. And I mean, there are always arguments you can find against restitution. I think that all the arguments we've heard against restitution, they are all just fig leaves. We need acts of restitution to debate and move forward. Dr. Legay, can you also give us your view? And can you also say something about how, from your perspective, African actors can be better involved? What kind of proposals or even solutions do you have for a stronger involvement of Africa's actors?
Thanks. It was very interesting to hear, especially a bit more about your experience, Sylvie, about it, because looking at what's going on in Germany, but also in the neighboring countries, in France, in Belgium, we do see a lot this perspective of state to state being the new norm, the new consensus for European powers to deal with restitution. And it's one way to do it, but it's not enough. And we see it, the new Belgium has passed a new law, and it's really a bilateral state-to-state dimension. France, there is a new report that came out recently, kind of pushing for the new laws that will frame the question of restitution. It's also pushed on a state-to-state basis, and it's not so good. And it's often in a way that European powers will also dictate the way of what to do with the objects, and this is not acceptable. It's simply not acceptable. And it's also a need, because what we see is also European countries looking at each other about how are things being done, what is happening, how to do things, and kind of looking at each other. And the case of Council would be a great one to show that it's not only country to country to deal with it. And in a way, the proactiveness is definitely something we need. It's absolutely unbelievable that it's still waiting for requests. European museums, European countries have the objects, have the archives, have the means, and it's from the outsiders to ask the request. No, it has to be on a proactive side, and then there's a question of engagement, but it's definitely a need to push, and Germany is doing things, other countries are looking at what Germany is doing, and there is just, a pressure and an impact definitely on what will happen with the Penny with what happened with Council, and there is an impact on other countries in that sense. So I think this proactiveness is definitely something we need to see elsewhere.
If I may still add, I mean, you were asking on some of the prerequisites, and obviously we experienced this. Sylvie has talked about visa issues. I mean, we have the same on a researcher level, inviting people to conferences, to exchanges, is really hard. Simply for getting visa as well for our colleagues, who would be very valuable, I would say, also for the communities in Africa, our African colleagues. They must, as you should, as activists and as the traditional leaders should, etc., community representatives, but also researchers should really come more frequently. And if the German government is interested in this, and if the German government has a coalition agreement on talking about our colonial past, sorry that I'm now talking English, but anyways, I mean, it's essential that you facilitate, that you show a willingness that this exchange actually happens. And if already on that very basic level of, I mean, embassies and their bureaucracies, this would not happen, I mean, you can question the willingness to push forward. So, I mean, it looks as if that would be a banal thing, but it's not banal. You need that exchange. We need to meet each other. We need to exchange. The more emotional side of it is very important, actually, being face to face with ancestors, with cultural objects, obviously triggers something, and that must be facilitated.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I just really want to say that it's also an issue of respect. If you cannot bring our objects back to us, we have the right to go to where our objects are kept. We have the right to go have the connection with our objects. And so the denial of a visa is some sort of hypocrisy on the part of the Germans and other, European countries that would preach freedom, would preach liberty, would claim to be upholding the values of democracy. So it becomes really, really difficult. The perspective of Africans is just so important in this conversation. Otherwise, if you're talking about us in our absence, then you are talking against us. That is how we see it. in most of these spaces, we are not given visas. And now we just wake up in the morning and we are told about preconditions that exist for the negotiations of the objects. Who is setting these preconditions? Who says that Germany, the state of Germany, must speak to the state of Cameroon? Who sets these preconditions? It becomes very confusing for us when we are sidelined, excluded, yet in the end, they will have to talk to us. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Marit. I see your hand is raised.
Ja, vielleicht zwei Dinge genau dazu.
Maybe two things. First of all, I'd like to say something about visa and visa policy. And here, I talk about that issue quite often because I think it is an essential element of any restitution process. In June, we are going to have a decolonial dialogue on freedom of movement, because this freedom of movement is really a crucial element. Whenever I have a project, I always experience that people get the denial of a visa, even if an event is financed by some ministry or the Foreign Office and invitations are extended, but still they end up in a problem with the embassy and they don't get a visa. So that's really strange. I mean, who has the power to take decisions and say these people are going to get a visa and these people are not going to get a visa? So there seems to be a problem we have to have a closer look at. Secondly, I also think it is important to think about traveling in the other direction, not always African people getting invited to come to Europe. It is just as important for Europeans to travel to Africa too. We need much more of this because many people are not really aware of what it means, what these gaps mean, that this absence of objects, of sacred objects, are really very meaningful. And I think it is therefore very important for Europeans to go and meet people in Africa, understand the context, to understand what this culture really means. That means, of course, first of all, Europeans have to get interested in the whole topic. And I'm not just talking about ethnological research trips. I'm talking about encounters on a human level, trying to understand. At the beginning of this year, I was in Nigeria, spent 2 months there. And one reason for that was that I wanted to understand the debate. Who are the actors? And of course, in 2 months, I cannot understand everything, every detail, although I have a knowledge base. Also, because of my family, I am quite well informed about what's happening in Nigeria. But it's important to be on the ground, to be able to understand, to at least try and understand what is happening in the countries concerned. And that is also important in order to understand the complexity of the situation and then see what can be done. And I always say, we have to abandon our paternalistic attitude. We should not always think we go there and we provide assistance. We have to really look at cooperation on an equal footing.
Thank you very much. I just heard some sirens in the background. I hope you didn't hear them. Well, are there any further points or aspects that the journalists would like to raise? Is there anything that you would like to add to the discussion? If that's not the case, I would like to move on to the questions from the audience. And I would like to ask everybody to put forward their questions, but also any questions, comments, or observations to be given via the Q&A tool. Well, I would also like to thank everybody already about the discussion that we have heard so far. Well, I just got the information that there are 2 people who have got questions, and let's see if I receive them on the in the right window. I can see them now, thanks to the technicians. Oh, and this is a question from somebody from the Manchester Museum. Nice to see you again. Great to have you back.
Speak and show us your face with the camera. Oh, you're there. Okay. Hi.
Hi, Aisha. It's me again. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. I think it's a build-up or follow-up to the earlier conversation in another space that we're in. Quite amazing. I'm very interested in perhaps also sharing with a colleague from Nigeria. I'm sorry, I didn't get your name properly. I'm Javulu. I'm curator of living cultures at Manchester University Museum, and we're also proactively thinking about unconditional repatriations of Benin cultural material. So we do have, and I'm disclosing to you, we don't have to wait for communities to come and knock on our doors and say, what do you have? We do have Benin cultural material. And for me as a curator of living cultures, one of the things that I'm always emphasizing is on this idea of truth-telling, accountability, and, because people wouldn't know what we hold if we don't tell them what we hold. I'm responsible for more than 35,000 stolen ethnographic objects from all over, from Africa, and, as a result of the expansion of the empire. So I think this is a very interesting conversation in terms of what can we really do to, as museums in the global north or in the UK, what can we do to account for what we hold? And I'm opening this up to you and to other colleagues on this idea or this notion of unconditional repatriations. No need for us to give communities conditions on how they would want to have back their objects. We can actually do the reverse and tell them what we hold and actively work with them to repatriate and return back these ancestors to communities. And to Sylvia, happy to see you again. And it's interesting that you're still grappling with bringing back Ngonzo back home. And I'd hope by now you'd have succeeded in bringing back Ngonzo back home. But it's very interesting how you spoke about the idea of proactivity and how we can have this German government proactively engaging with communities in Cameroon and returning back Ngonzo. So it's more like comments, and I'm opening up to colleagues and how we can work together. The Benin cultural material has been topical, and at Manchester Museum, we're really open to this kind of openness and dialogue on how we can return. We have, I think, 18 identified pieces, not only the bronzes, but also the ivory, tusks, and other associated material from Benin. And if you want to have a conversation with me, I'm really open, and I want to build collaborations and dialogue on this illicitly acquired and stolen cultural material that we hold in museums.
Thank you, Njobati. I picked your name. I'm Oluwatoyin. And yes, I'm happy to have this conversation even after now, and then we could collaborate. But the beautiful thing I think on a moral grounds, it's so just cool that the museums are saying, your own museum particularly, saying, we have this, what do we do with it? We want to give it back. How do you want us to give it back? You get what I mean? Not the British Museum now, but other museums are saying, we have this. And it's basically increasing inclusivity. So the process of restitution and taking it onto decolonialism within the museum space is happening. So now that you've opened your door to say, see, I have this 18 I've identified, you're giving the community and the source community the chance to say, hey, okay, you could keep them, but I will tell you what it actually means. And I will tell you in which rituals or in which shrines or in which traditional festivals or in which traditional ceremonies that we use these things. And then that way there is a collaboration. So we're decolonizing. It's not me just coming into the museum and just seeing a head and you say this head is a funerary object. Mm-hmm. No. But you're using your museum as that neutral space to say, tell me about yourself. And because you're opening it up, There's a lot that you will be able to learn. So knowledge is two ways, because no culture is superior than any. But cultures are all equal. You get what I mean? So what you're doing or what you're looking to do, it's interesting. And I know that we keep making reference to the Benin collections, Benin bronzes, but there's so many other communities that have been either looted or bought legally or illegally, that we've used their collections to build up our storage and our museums. But by opening it up, we're able to say, come tell us who you are. Let us know the knowledge system about this. Let us, the visibility, you bring about visibility.
She's gone.
Okay, I think the sound.
Ikenga is like the soul of a man. And when the man dies, why you?
Okay, we're gonna jump to Sylvie now, because Sylvie, I think you raised your hand, or did you? Okay, bring it back down. After that, Molemo, and of course, we didn't forget about Professor Silayo. You will speak right after that.
Yes, I really want to appreciate, you coming up, telling us that the Manchester Museum has this, and you are so proactive. You want to give it back, but I must say that.
Okay.
It's a beautiful thing you want to, but, okay, she's here. Hi, we lost you for a moment.
Yeah, that's the Africa that we are in. So, like I was saying, there are different aspects that we could bring out from this. I remembered that someone did mention about the kind of museology that will be happening in Africa. Have we thought about the open museums? We're looking at three models, three levels of museums. As an African, even as an European, when I come to your house, your home is the first level of museum, because it tells me about your travels, it tells me about your faith, it tells me about you, who you are, it tells me about what you like from your photos and your memorabilia. I'm able to tell about where you've been, what you do. And then the next level is the shrine, which could pass as a church or a mosque. You get what I mean? And it's only the devotees of a certain group that will be able to tell you that these are the relics and these are what we use them for. And these things are made to be used. And when they're not more in use, they make new ones to replace them. They're not ethnographic collection here. And then the level of museology will be, or of a museum space will be the palace. That is where you keep the best of things of the community. And you only see them during festivals. They're respected. Sylvia talked about respect. We talk about equality. We talk about empathy. You wanting to know from the source community is a way of opening up that platform to have a knowledge system, authorship of knowledge come from Africa. And I think when we, it's so interesting. We want to have conferences about Africa and we have to travel outside Africa to go and talk about Africa. When are everyone going to come to Africa, and let's talk about Africa in Africa, not coming to Africa because we want to take something away or because we want to, take their artifacts or anything, but come and let's talk about Africa. Come, let's tell us about our food. Come, let's tell us about our artifacts and what they mean. A lot of people know about the Ibeji dolls, but do they know what the source community do with the Ibeji dolls? So it's time. Thank you so much, Njabulo. I will take that offer. We will do much more, but it's about making restitution to decolonization of the museum space. And let the museum start being a space where...
Thank you so much. Is restitution happening live right now in this Zoom? I cannot believe it. Molemo, Sylvie, sorry, you got cut up, and then Molemo. We have to kind of respect the time. There's lots of more interesting questions that will probably spark some new thoughts. Thank you so much, Njabulo, just so we keep our answers a bit short.
All right, can you? Yeah, all right. I will just be very brief with what I want to say. I just want to say thank you for really coming up, being open, and telling us that you have these. But I have a feeling no one can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. Oh, you can hear me. All right. you know, it's important to reflect on the connection and how intertwined these institutions and the legislature are, because you have the willingness to really return, but the laws in the UK, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, and I'm going to respond.
All right. Yes, but I want to know, what are the laws in the UK? The UK has a very, very important role that played in the colonial history of Cameroon.
Yeah.
But they are like this landlocked European state that is not very open to the question of, you know, restitution. And I have listened to a lot of debate. And in as much as the museum is willing to return, I wonder how willing is the state to, you know, let those things go with the arguments they always bring up.
Yeah. Can I quickly respond just a second? So Manchester Museum is a university museum. We don't operate under state legislature. So we have done some repatriations before. We've returned 43 secret, sacred, and ceremonial objects to Australia. And we're also going to return other objects to Australia through this proactive engagement with communities. So it won't be the first for Manchester University Museum to return cultural objects back to community. Our approach is on unconditional repatriations. We identify unethically acquired cultural materials, not even cultural materials, but living cultures as per se. This category of objectimization, objects, is not really what represents the culture. So we have done this before, as we had a precedent in returning in 2019. So the Benin material won't be a challenge at all, because we don't really act like the British Museum. We're a university museum. We've got some kind of leverage to negotiate. We only send it to our board of directors who approve for us to return. So it's not so much about national legislation as compared to the other national museums. We're a university museum.
Thank you so much, Njabulo. And I'm pretty sure you can exchange contacts and keep the conversation going. Professor Mena, just do you have a comment? Let's try to hear Professor Silayo first, and then maybe we can do a combined answer. Please, Professor Silayo, the floor is yours. You may speak and turn on your camera. Hello, have we lost you? Okay, you could write in the chat once you're ready to speak. We have 3 really interesting questions also in our Q&A tool. Thank you so much for participating. I will just go as they see them. Oh, you here, Professor Silayo? Okay, great.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Valence Silayo, as I've been introduced. Just got a quick contribution. I was in and out for some reasons, and that's why again I'm coming in. There's a very burning point that when I got an access into the meeting, it was a discussion on the table about the digitization. That who are we digitizing the objects for? I mean, do we know who owns those objects? If we really know who owns those objects, and we talk in the perspectives of the owners of the objects, then we wouldn't be saying digitization is the alternative of returning the object. It could be one way of expressing, of storing those objects, but not an option for not returning them. Why I'm saying this? How many people can access those materials digitally, particularly those who own the objects? I'm talking about the communities in the villages, in the local areas where there's no internet, or internet is very low, very minimal. Those who owns the mobile phone. I'm using my mobile phone right now. I'm in Dar es Salaam, in the middle of Dar es Salaam, driving home, but I'm getting difficult to follow the meeting. How about the person, my countrymen, my countrymen who are living in Kilimanjaro, in the northern part of Tanzania, where they have these objects taken? Will they be able to access those materials digitally? Well, I'm not saying that digital form and storing the material digitally is not it's not a good thing, but I'm saying it's not an option. So okay, fine, we are storing them digitally for you. No, we can store them digitally, but let's continue discussing, debating on how we can engage these people, these communities, on the best way for them to access the materials, to access those objects, to be in contact with them again. A colleague here came up and said, well, if you cannot return them, then let us go to them. Do not block us visiting them. First, I'm coming to German, to a German museum, for example, to see the objects from Kilimanjaro. My visa should not be an issue because I'm going to see the cultural objects. I should be given access those objects. That is one. Another thing I wanted to mention quickly is the importance of engaging communities in this debate. It is the community who made those objects, who knows why they made those objects. Their culture is not, they say, we know that culture is dynamic. They know, I mean, we cannot say that, oh, well, you are using this object for ritual purpose. Nowadays, you are a born again Christian or a Muslim, so you don't need this. No, it's not our intention to tell them that. Let them, their culture, say that. For them, they know why they made it, when they use it, and how they use it. So we need to give them that authority. We need to listen to them, but make a clear provenance and correct information about those objects. And then that's so we can talk about which one we need to return, which one we need to put in the digital form, why and when, and all those things. Apart from that, I think we will be missing a lot of points in between, especially knowing why we are doing the restitution. If the community doesn't know why we are doing the restitution, if we keep debating about the restitution without the communities, then I think we are doing something wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Silayo, for your words. Does anyone want to add something to that? I didn't see no disagreement. I think the whole panel fully agrees with what you said, but maybe you want to say something to Professor Silayo. Then you may raise your hand. If not, then thank you for your commentary. And I think it kind of matches the first question that I see here in the Q&A tool, which is also a question of outreach. Who is discussing who is discussing what with who? It's from Heike Becker. Thank you so much. It says Sylvie has just brought up the important issue: who is speaking to whom? As the Namibian activists say, it cannot be about us without us. Unfortunately, this is still very much the way these conversations are conducted, as Professor Silayo was just stating. The recent UN Special Rapporteur's report has raised this powerfully for the Namibian case. Perhaps the question is, how can activists and researchers and artists from different former German colonies and Germany connect? Who wants to answer the question?
I mean, vielleicht habe ich eine halbe Antwort darauf, also eher das passt ganz gut zu dem, was wir...
Maybe I've got half an answer because it goes hand in hand with what we just heard from Manchester Museum. We do have the situation in Germany too. We do have different ownership relationships. They are private collections, we have municipal collections, we have university museums. And then these things will be negotiated at the end of the day on the level of our federal states, the Länder in Germany. But we must be activating all these levels. We shouldn't sit back and wait until central governments talk to one another. Because if we just sit back and do that, wait for governments, then we are going to have this kind of strict centralization process. There was also a question about UNESCO and their role in this whole game. And my fear is, knowing Germany and knowing our propensity to be overly bureaucratic and develop all kinds of laws before we do something, then we slow down the process. So we need a beginning on a decentralized level. And so it's very wise to link universities, municipalities, federal states, provinces. All these levels must be activated. That may sound chaotic, but it will speed up things. And I think that would be much better, because we have so many actors also in Germany that are willing and ready to restitute sooner than later. Marit wanted to take the floor. I wanted to move over to you anyway in order to talk about the role of the diaspora and all these shades of grey in between, so to say. Let me do just this. I cannot really answer the question that was put in the chat because I really don't know. We always try out new things, and I can only say that I do have this project called Talking Objects, and we have so far built up a very good network, and our team of curators consists of persons from Kenya, Senegal, and there we have a very active exchange. And all of that happened on the basis of our common approach. We have first of all met the persons, developed the network, and we take care of this network. We cooperate, we work with one another. I've been doing that a couple of years now, and are based on a relationship of trust. And of course, this project is also important. What I always see in Germany is the invisibility of the African diaspora. The diaspora doesn't play a role. In Hamburg, recently, the Benin Dialogue Group had their closing events, and there were quite a few interesting questions coming from Nigerians. In particular, there was one Nigerian person from Edo State, Nigeria, and he asked, how about the diaspora? It's such a large group of people from the Benin area that now live in Hamburg, and why they were never involved in the dialogue. I do not know why it happened, but it was an interesting question. And it stayed on my mind, and I see it also in other contexts. What is the role of diasporas? Of course, diasporas are usually very different, diverse communities. But of course, involving them makes things even more complex. But in those negotiations, also the different diasporas should be included, because the world has so many different shades of grey, so to say. There is no one single Europe, one single Africa. There are so many different communities that can be in touch with one another. And there are also the large communities, African communities living in Europe, but they bring in their experience. They also have certain ideas and wishes. And so it was very interesting for me to hear that person from Benin who said, I live in Hamburg, and if you now restitute the Benin bronzes, they will be taken from me again. So that was an interesting discussion in a way. And so I think indeed we should integrate diaspora groups much more into the overall debates. Thank you very much. It was just a brief insight into all the complex issues. And of course, it's impossible to talk about everything in depth. Is there anybody else who would like to take the floor? If not, I'm going to move on to the next question that came in. And that question was asked by Alexandra Galindo.
To all of you, this is a question for all of the members of the panel. I was wondering if you would have comments or examples on what has happened at a community level after restitutions. Also schon wieder eine Frage, die in Richtung community.
Again, it's a question about community away from the official institutions. What can we hear from African? Molemo wanted to take the floor.
just a quick response. I mean, I think one thing to say is that community doesn't necessarily mean separate from institutions. And often, in many cases, there is a close relationship between, say, African museum professionals who work on behalf of the state and community members, not always an easy relationship. But I want to reiterate the point is not for things to be easy. About really hundreds of years of pain and destruction, and so it's not going to be easy to repair. There are also a wide range of kind of results around what happens with processes of trying to then sort of reintegrate both human remains of our ancestors and objects back into communities, and these have like varying kinds of impacts. Certainly there's some cases where it's been done better than others. Obviously with human remains, that's often kind of following the rites and rituals of burial and ensuring a kind of respectful laying to rest of human beings. And there are a number of quite good case studies in this case. With objects, this then varies quite significantly as well. And I think one of the primary issues is that we don't have easy access to this information, and there's not enough sharing happening amongst Africans so that there can be a kind of sharing of expertise and skills. And this is the primary work that Open Restitution Africa is doing. And we hope to have our platform of restitution process at least at beta stage by the end of this year in order to share this information. But one thing I'd like to mention, and Sylvie was part of a workshop where we were kind of trying to unpack some of these questions. And in certain cases, there is the situation where a community doesn't want the object back. And it is a museum that doesn't want to have the object in its collection due to it being unfashionable and kind of not considered ethical any longer. There's often situations where communities refuse objects because they have been destroyed in the process of their theft, you know? And they no longer hold the value because they have been taken. I raise this point because I want to reiterate again that this doesn't necessarily mean a simple solution, a comfortable, happy situation where the community goes, thank you, Europe, for returning our things. And in one community, they wanted to burn the objects. And the museum professionals from Africa, of course, go, you know, panic. You can't burn the objects. We're supposed to be looking after them. No, but I think this is an interesting case where we ask the question again, and Jabula raised this point around unconditional return of who owns the objects. What really is the purpose of restitution? Is the purpose of restitution a negotiation of new ethical relationships between Africa and Europe? Or is it a kind of patronizing, as Mariette mentioned before, kind of renegotiation of how we want things to continue to be done because we think these are the best ways that things are done. And I think it's just trying to hold on to the fact that it's going to be difficult to repair these relationships. These things are going to have difficult questions and difficult answers, and we're going to have to struggle through them. And I can say from a personal perspective that Andreas raised this point of the German capacity to have difficult conversations, and that I get to the point where I find this capacity exhausting and quite overwhelming. But I think that capacity is an important sort of German skill to be able to hold on to in this process of being able to remain in difficulty when things are hard, and not to demand that Africans have everything together when this is obviously going to be a much longer journey.
Thank you very much. Moving on to our last question before we get to close this session. Please can the panelists shed light on how the conceptual difference between restitution, repatriation, and reparation feature in this discourse of restitution? Are we not playing the silence, discovery, and abolition game again? I'm just gonna pass it on. You may raise your hand. Thank you to Olusegun Morakinyo for the question. Molemo, please go ahead.
I can try to answer this question, but I have to say up front, I don't actually know what the silence, discovery, and abolition game is. But I can say that at Open Restitution Africa, we work from the perspective of restitution, because our primary interest is in this question of repair and restoration in the African context. And that work is certainly the kind of the main work to be done, right? The moment of return is the small little glimpse of like the start, and many of us have said it's the start of really the hard work, which is to repair people who have been broken. So that's our interest in restitution and the idea of restoring. I think the term repatriation is quite a difficult one. It comes from very much a kind of state-specific notion of the kind of pater, right? Returning to the fatherland or returning to the state in this way. And I think this word is not so helpful. South Africa tends to use the term repatriation and sort of operates in these very kind of, which we've seen in other places as well, these like really heavy state formalist kind of performances of repairing something, repatriation to the country. That have these kind of patriotic tendencies to them. But I think the question of reparation is, of course, the primary question and the main reason why it's been so difficult to talk about restitution. In many cases, it's been Africans' decisions to try and remove reparation off the table just to be able to have the conversation. But for sure that it may have been moved slightly to the side. It's not off the table. I think Namibia is perhaps one of the places that leads this most strongly, and the conversation is certainly not gone, and we are not going to replace the return of objects with a true conversation about what reparation might mean.
Thank you so much for differentiating. I want to, we have 2 more questions. We have another person that is raising their hand, but I would like to read out Valérie Vibon's comment, because I believe he's already put a comment in the chat section, and maybe you want to react to it as well. From his position, it would have been very interesting to also have among the panelists one person from the authorities of Germany who need to play a role in the discussion, in instance from the SKP or from the foreign ministry. Everyone here is just agreeing as if though after this restitution will happen faster, but the power lies elsewhere. Does anyone want to say anything about that? That should be, might be a question that should also be directed to the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung, but maybe someone would love to comment on that. Okay, I think the panel...
Vielleicht kann ich kurz was dazu sagen, weil das ja vielleicht auch das kuratorische Team betrifft und wir ja die Auswahl...
I may be able to answer on that. It also has to do with the curating team. Yes, on the one hand, I would confirm that the power actually, and to a certain degree, lies elsewhere. But what we're trying to achieve with this dialogue format is to identify different possibilities of power that could come about by using networks and collaborations that also serve to question power constellations or to make public that the power lies elsewhere, or to look for different power structures. And as representatives of certain institutions, where they defend positions that are known to us, but inviting people that stand for a specific opinion or a function. Oh, well, maybe I can add on that. This is what I said earlier on. Do not only look at the government. For example, the Community Council in Freiburg has made a decision. There was a question concerning restitution, and we will do that. There is a certain, threshold concerning value. I don't know who can determine that. That is part of an individual decision. Governments are most powerful, but they do not have everything. So do try at every level.
Another familiar face.
Thank you.
Rasul has joined, and you may ask your questions now. Good to have you here.
Is that for me? Greetings to all colleagues, and just to say how much I've enjoyed this discussion and the eloquence of all my colleagues, Sylvie, Molemo, and just one or two things I want to add about restitution and repatriation before I make a suggestion about the possibilities for the diaspora. And that is, and it's signaled in the title of this gathering that we have, that our German colleagues do not have a word for restitution. Our German colleagues only have a word, giving back, Rückgabe. And so, quite frankly, our German colleagues are trapped inside of a project of giving. And we are right to think about restitution politically in very different ways, because restitution is very different from repatriation. Okay, for other settler colonial situations such as North America, Australia, and New Zealand, where the sovereignty and the authority of the state over indigenous colonized communities is in doubt, they use the term sovereignty very deliberately. And so I think we have to respect that. But in our African colonial problem is the idea of repatriation simply refers to a giving, not a politics of demanding. Restitution is a politics of demanding. And so the work that Open Restitution Africa does, the work that our comrades do in other countries is very important in building a politics and a language of restitution. And so once we enter this framework of restitution, we have to accept that we have to leave the framework of museum governance. So the term human remains is a term of museum governance. The term object is also a term of museum governance. And restitution seeks to combat museum governance. And these are things that we are learning all the time. We don't have templates. We're going to meetings all the time. 2 weeks ago, I was in a meeting with Professor Mehler in Freiburg, where I just learned an incredible amount about the restitution that we are helping to happen from Freiburg. And one of the things that I realized only afterwards that was missing from our process there, and I haven't had a chance to talk with Andreas about this, is that Freiburg did not create a community of care. A community of care. And that is where the diaspora comes in. In the Namibian returns from Berlin, the activists in Berlin, in some ways, constituted a community of care because these were the remains of murdered people in a genocide. And so we need to think about the language we use, the politics of restitution in a way that restitution does not end with return. It begins when the demand happens. It begins when the work has to happen after the return, and it cannot simply be a Rückgabe. It has to be a restitution. And so the other thing we have to do is we have to question, we are expected to be experts about ourselves. South Africa, Cameroon, Anglophone Cameroon, specifically. We have to worry about the way in which restitution in Germany is happening within the ways in which Germany is governed and within the ways in which museums in Germany are governed. And so, like this important discussion of the nation and the community, Very important. I mean, I've just learned new things in Zurich about this. I think the situation that we have about Ngonso is very important for us to take on board. But we also have to recognize that when our German colleagues first started talking about restitution, they had individual museums in Germany thinking that they were going to do direct restitutions to African communities in an ethnological way. They want the restitution to be ethnological and to perpetuate an ethnological framework. Do not, and so we said to them, you do not violate the sovereignty of African nations. You don't do that, but at the same time, nations cannot do the work of restitution. They can only facilitate it. They cannot do it themselves. So we are learning things all the time. And I just want to express my admiration for this wonderful discussion tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your perspective, dear Siraj Rasool. Everyone was just going like this in full agreement with what you have said. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the conversation. We are a bit at the end. I want to see if there are some questions left. I see Njabulu has another question. It's a really interesting one. Maybe Oluwatoyin can quickly try to answer that question. It's about the recent challenge by the Restitution Study Group, which is against the return of Benin material on moral grounds, that the Kingdom of Benin was received in the enslavement process. A strong argument. What would you say to Njabulu's question?
First, I want to say thank you, Siraj, for that expose on restitution, repatriation. That was really awesome. To Njabulu, I will say this, I salute the courage of the Restitution Study Group to be able to stand up, get the court injunction, just do these things to say, we belong to Benin, or this is part of us, don't take it away. I salute their courage, but the truth is, they should come home, be part of us, and then they can see the object. But to answer their question, there are still 12 objects in the museum there that they can still see. It's just a case of me saying Milka, the cocoa that was used for Milka, was gotten from Ota in Nigeria, Ogun State. It's not the business of who's taking the Milka, what content or whatever. For them, what constitutes the bronze was simply because they felt the manila used in purchasing the slaves with which they are descendants of was used in making this bronze. And for that reason, they shouldn't send the objects back. I will simply say to them, it doesn't work like that. The objects, long before colonization, Benins were casted. The casting procedure or the production, there's a possibility that it expanded with the influence of Portuguese and all. Initially, it was all about the West wanted what Benins had. They were selling their wares. They had oil, they had textiles. It was business as usual. And Benins is so far from where all the slave trade issues happened. So as it is for now, it's not really about that. But I salute their courage that they could come up and say, we belong to so-so part. And for this reason, it just shows how important Benin has become. So yeah, they're welcome to have a piece of the pie, but they've got to come home. They've got to come home for us to have a discussion. That will be my reaction. But yes, I do understand. And like I said from the beginning, there's a multiplicity of implications for the Benin bronzes. The Benin collections is not just the bronzes. And now it has had multiplicity of meanings, but we must first appreciate, acknowledge that it started from a place. And to that place, it has to go back to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Molemo, you can add.
I'm sorry, anyone knows, I'll be very quick. I think this is exactly the point, is many ethnicities, kingdoms were forced to go into slave trading as a way to fight back against being slaves themselves. You know, communities were destroyed. The African continent is still reeling from the pain of the slave trade, you know? And again, restitution is not simply about returning objects. It is about how do we repair all of this damage, right? And here we see the perfect example. Africa has not begun to engage really meaningfully with what the slave trade has done to it and done to the diaspora. And here's a situation where restitution begins to open up these wounds and force us to try to repair these questions and to really engage with them. And that's really the point. Can we stay in difficulty with these really difficult questions?
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to our wonderful people that were listening and staying focused, concentrated, asking lots of questions. I am really full with many thoughts. And I will switch back into German. I don't know why I'm speaking English. Sorry, ich rede jetzt einfach wieder Deutsch.
I am now speaking German again. That gives me the opportunity to speak a little more structured. I would like to say thanks to everybody. First and foremost, I must say there is a lot of food for thought that I'm going to take home. What I have learned is that we do have a momentum, a moment that can be a beginning. Many things have already begun, have been developed and will develop. And all of that developed because there were so many people who have resisted, have stood up in many different positions, in many different places. So I'm looking forward to more discussions that we are going to have in the future. Marit started today, and maybe Marit would like to say a few words about what she has learned. I mean, you work in so many different positions and places, and you're going to be always involved in dealing with all these topics. Maybe you'd like to tell us something about what is the lesson learned for you? Well, at any rate, it was a very positive event. I have received a lot of information and ideas, and I took many notes. And there's so many things I still have to think about. But it's important for me to say that we're going to move on. And this is what we wanted to achieve with our decolonial dialogues. It is quite clear we are not just simply sitting here and having a talk and then that's the end of it. We see that as a comprehensive, ongoing process. And it's the second round of the decolonial dialogue this year. Maybe we are going to have more rounds. And last year we talked about restitution already, and it's interesting to see that this discussion develops and widens. Last year, many things have happened regarding some topics. There's some other topics where nothing has happened yet. But for me, it's important to continue the dialogue, and it's wonderful to meet many people that I have met in other contexts too, and hopefully we are going to see each other again. And for me, it was a great pleasure also to get questions from the audience. So there were really many comments, and I think it's a very valuable process. And for me, these 2 hours of our dialogue were very fertile. So I look forward to continuing the work. I would like to thank all our panelists once again, and I hope very much that this is not our last encounter, not our last meeting and discussion. I'd like to invite you to our further dialogues, decolonial dialogues. There are 2 more events in the pipeline, so to say. We are going to talk about transcontinental mobility. How many encounters do we need for decolonialization? I can already say, of course, we need more encounters, and of course, we need visas for that purpose. And then we are going to have one more topic on the 21st of September after the summer break. We are going to meet again to talk about the relationships between men and nature and how can we succeed in protecting biodiversity, both in Africa and in Europe. So also a very interesting topic. Having said this, I would like to wish you a nice evening. Hopefully you also are taking home some food for thought, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.